I want you to look at a wedding photo with me. Not literally, you can't see it, obviously, but I want you to picture the kind of photo everyone has somewhere in their house. A receiving line. A blur of relatives and friends standing in loose rows, half of them not even looking at the camera, caught in the in-between moment before the photographer says, "Okay, on 3. Now imagine looking at that photo, one you've looked at 100 times over 10 years of marriage, and noticing, for the first time, that someone who used to be standing in the third row is gone. Not cropped out. Not faded. Gone, and replaced, seamlessly, with a slightly different angle of the tablecloth behind her, rendered so cleanly that if you hadn't spent a decade unconsciously memorizing every face in that photograph, you would never, ever have known anyone had ever been standing there at all. My name is Sarah. My husband David and I have been married for 10 years. And 8 months ago, I discovered that at some point during our marriage, David had quietly replaced dozens of our physical wedding photographs, the actual printed portraits, hanging in our hallway, sitting in our parents' living rooms, tucked into photo albums we'd shown our own children, with AI-generated versions, doctored just enough to erase one specific person from every single frame she appeared in. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know why she mattered enough to warrant a decade of quiet, patient digital erasure. What I knew was this: my husband had spent 10 years rewriting our wedding day, one pixel at a time, and I had no idea why until I started looking at the negatives. I need to back up and tell you how I even noticed this in the first place, because it wasn't dramatic. It was almost embarrassingly small, the kind of detail that only stands out if you're the specific kind of person who remembers things the way I do, which is to say, visually, almost photographically, sometimes to David's mild irritation over the years, since I can recall the exact seating arrangement at a dinner party from 6 years ago while he genuinely cannot remember what we had for dinner last Tuesday. Our wedding, for context, was a fairly traditional affair, a church ceremony, a reception at a converted barn venue about 40 minutes outside the city, roughly 200 guests, the kind of day that felt, at the time, like the happiest and most straightforward day of my entire life. David and I had been together for 3 years before we got married, and I would have told you, without a moment's hesitation, that I knew everything meaningful there was to know about him, his family history, his old relationships, the general shape of who he'd been before we met. I've since had to sit with how confidently wrong that certainty turned out to be. We were repainting our hallway, which meant taking down the gallery wall of framed photos we'd had up since we moved into our house, engagement photos, our wedding portraits, a few candids from the reception. I was cleaning the glass on each frame before rehanging them, and I got to one specific photo, a group shot taken during the cocktail hour, my side of the family clustered together near the bar, and something about it snagged in my memory the wrong way. In the photo, there were 6 people in the group. I remembered 7. I sat there on the floor of our hallway, glass cleaner in hand, trying to figure out if I was simply misremembering a 10-year-old moment, which felt entirely possible. Memory does that, fills gaps, smooths edges, invents details that feel true but aren't. I almost let it go. I actually did let it go, for a few weeks, filing it under the category of things your brain does that don't mean anything, and went back to the ordinary business of our life together, David's job in commercial real estate, my own work managing a small physical therapy practice, the 2 kids we were raising, the mortgage, the 1,000 small logistics that make up a marriage a decade in. Then, about a month later, my mother was going through old photo albums to make a memory book for my younger sister's upcoming wedding, and she called me, confused, holding a physical print, an actual, developed photograph from a disposable camera someone had left on the tables that night, the kind every wedding from that era had scattered around for guests to use. She said, "I don't remember this woman being at your wedding. Do you know who this is?" She sent me a photo of the photo. And there she was, a woman I didn't recognize, mid-conversation with a small cluster of people near what I could tell was the edge of the dance floor, wearing a deep green dress, her back partially to the camera. I didn't recognize her. I assumed, at the time, she was a +1 of someone's, one of those wedding guests you never actually meet because the reception is a blur of 200 people and you're the bride and everyone wants 5 minutes of your attention. But it nagged at me. Because the framed photo in our hallway, the professionally shot, formally posed version of what appeared to be nearly the same moment, same cluster of people, same approximate angle, taken by our actual wedding photographer rather than a disposable camera, didn't have her in it. It had 6 people where the disposable camera photo had 7, and where the disposable camera photo showed a woman in a green dress standing at the edge of the frame, the professional photo showed only the dance floor's decorative lighting, extended smoothly across that exact space, as though nothing and no one had ever stood there at all. I told myself, again, that there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe she'd stepped out of frame between shots. Maybe the professional photographer had simply taken the photo from a slightly different angle than the guest with the disposable camera, at a slightly different moment, and I was building a mystery out of 2 photos that weren't actually depicting the same instant at all. I want to be honest with you, I almost let this go entirely. It's embarrassing, in hindsight, how close I came to simply closing that mental file and moving on with my life. What stopped me was something small and specific, a detail in the lighting that I'm not a photographer. I don't know anything technical about lighting, aperture, any of it. But I know what shadows look like when they're real, because I've spent 10 years staring at these particular photographs on my own hallway wall, and something about the shadow pattern in that professional photo had always looked, in a way I'd never consciously registered before, slightly too smooth. Too even. Like the light in that one specific section of the frame didn't quite match the light everywhere else in the photo. Once I noticed it in that one photo, I couldn't stop noticing it. I went through our entire wedding album, the physical one, the leather-bound book David's mother had commissioned as a gift, the one we keep on our coffee table, and I started looking, specifically, for places where the light or the background seemed subtly inconsistent with everything around it. And once I knew what I was looking for, I found it in 4 more photographs. A group shot outside the ceremony venue, where a section of the hedge behind the wedding party looked slightly denser, slightly more uniform in texture, than the natural, slightly patchy hedge everywhere else in the frame. A candid shot from the reception where a stretch of empty dance floor had a strange, faint doubling in the reflection of the overhead lights, the kind of subtle visual artifact I now understand, but didn't then, is a known signature of certain AI image editing tools when they're asked to fill in a removed section of a photo using the surrounding pixels as a reference. I brought this to David that night, not accusingly, more confused than anything. I showed him the disposable camera photo from my mother, showed him the framed version, and asked if he had any idea who the woman in the green dress was, and why she seemed to be missing from our formal photos. I remember his face very specifically in that moment, because it's the kind of expression you don't fully register the significance of until much later, when you're replaying it over and over trying to understand what you missed. It wasn't confusion. It was the specific, controlled stillness of someone doing very fast, very careful math behind their eyes about how much they were about to have to explain. He said he didn't know who she was. He said maybe she was a +1, exactly the theory I'd already talked myself into and out of. He said the lighting differences were probably just artifacts of scanning old prints, or different cameras, or restoration work the photographer had done years ago to fix water damage on a few images, a detail he offered so specifically, so readily, that at the time it actually reassured me. It sounded like an answer with texture, an answer that came from someone who genuinely remembered a mundane, forgettable detail from a decade ago. I believed him. For almost 2 more months, I believed him completely, and I want to say that clearly, because I think it matters. I am not a naturally suspicious person, and I did not go looking for a decade-long secret. I went looking for one confusing detail in one photograph, got a plausible answer, and moved on with my life, the way any reasonable person would. About 6 weeks after that conversation, I was looking for a document on our shared family computer, a scanned copy of our marriage certificate, needed for something administrative and boring, a passport renewal, and in searching the file system for anything with wedding in the name, I came across a folder I didn't recognize, buried 3 directories deep, labeled simply archive_restore. Inside were dozens of image files. High-resolution scans of our physical wedding photographs, the same ones hanging in our hallway, the same ones in the leather album, except each file had 2 versions, sitting side by side in matched pairs, distinguished only by a suffix. One file ending in _original. One file ending in _v2, or in some cases, _v3, _v4, as though the same image had gone through multiple rounds of editing over what the file metadata, when I checked it, revealed spanned nearly the entire decade of our marriage, The earliest edits dated less than a year after our wedding, the most recent dated just 4 months before I found the folder at all. I opened the first _original file with genuine dread, already suspecting what I'd find, and there she was. The woman in the green dress, standing at the edge of a group photo I'd looked at 1,000 times, present in the original scan and completely absent in every subsequent version. I went through file after file. Group shots. A candid from the ceremony itself, where she was visible, barely, in the far background, seated in what I now understood was the section of pews reserved for extended family and close friends, not a random +1 at all, but someone seated, deliberately, in a section of the church reserved for people who mattered to one of us specifically. A photo from the rehearsal dinner the night before, where she was standing close enough to David, in a moment of genuine, easy laughter between them, that even in a grainy, slightly out-of-focus original scan, the familiarity between them was unmistakable to anyone actually looking for it. That I sat at that computer for almost 3 hours, going through every paired file, watching a version of my own wedding day get rewritten in front of me, one careful edit at a time, spanning 10 years of patient, deliberate work. Not a single dramatic act of deletion. A decade of small, careful maintenance, the way you'd tend a garden, except what David had been tending, quietly, for 10 years, was the systematic removal of one specific woman from the entire visual record of our marriage's beginning. I didn't confront him that night. I know, by now, if you've watched any of my other videos, that this is a pattern for me, needing to understand before I react, needing evidence before I accuse, because 10 years of marriage doesn't unravel on a folder full of file names, even file names as damning as these. I needed to know who she was, and I needed to know it from somewhere other than David, because I no longer trusted that his first answer would be his honest one. Before I went any further, I did something that might sound excessive, but that I don't regret. I reached out, anonymously at first, to a digital forensics consultant who specializes in image authentication, someone I found through a photography forum after searching, somewhat desperately, for anyone who could tell me definitively whether what I was looking at was actually evidence of AI manipulation or simply my own overactive imagination stitching a conspiracy out of ordinary scanning artifacts. I sent her 3 of the paired image files, with identifying details cropped out, and asked for an honest assessment. Her response came back within 2 days, and it removed any remaining doubt I'd been quietly holding on to. She confirmed what I'd started to suspect on my own, that the _V3 and _V4 versions of the images showed clear, identifiable signatures of generative AI in painting, the specific technology used to seamlessly fill in a removed section of a photograph using surrounding pixels as a reference. She pointed out details I hadn't even noticed myself, a very slight, almost imperceptible warping in a tablecloth pattern where it had been artificially extended, a shadow that fell at an angle inconsistent with the actual light source visible elsewhere in the same frame. She told me something else that stuck with me for weeks afterward. She said that in her professional experience, this kind of methodical, iterative editing, going back to the same images repeatedly over years as better tools became available, almost never happens by accident, and almost never happens for a trivial reason. People don't maintain a secret like this for a decade unless the secret itself is significant enough to justify that much ongoing effort. That confirmation was what finally gave me the confidence to stop investigating quietly and start asking the question directly. That I started with the one piece of information I actually had, her face, and the fact that she'd been seated in the section of the church reserved for people close to David specifically, since his side of the guest list had been organized separately from mine, and I still had, tucked away in a box of old wedding planning materials, the original seating chart we'd built together. Cross-referencing the seating chart against the guest list took an evening. Most of David's side was people I knew well, his parents, his brother, a handful of college friends I'd met dozens of times over the years. But there was one name on that specific section of the chart I genuinely didn't recognize, a name I'd apparently never thought twice about in 10 years, because wedding guest lists are full of names you don't personally know, friends of friends, family you've never met, co-workers from a job before you were together. The name was Claire. I searched that name, combined with David's, and after several unproductive attempts, I found something on an old, mostly abandoned social media account, a photo, nearly 12 years old now, of David and a woman matching the description, matching the face from the wedding photos, tagged with a caption that made my stomach drop in a way I still remember with total clarity. It was a photo from what was captioned as, "The happiest day," posted a little over a year before David and I met, showing David and this woman, Claire, standing together in front of a small group of friends, her hand extended toward the camera, a ring visible on her finger. David had been engaged before we met. He had never told me. I want to pause here and say something honest. An unmentioned prior engagement, on its own, wouldn't have been the crisis this eventually became. People have pasts. People have relationships that ended before they met the person they'd spend their life with, and plenty of reasonable people simply don't bring up every prior relationship in detail, especially one that ended before things got serious with someone new. If that had been the whole story, a prior engagement he'd simply never mentioned, awkward but not sinister, I think I could have processed it, hurt but understanding, and moved forward. But that wasn't the whole story. Because if Claire was simply an ex from before our relationship even began, there was no reason for her to be seated in the family section of our wedding, 10 years later, on the single most important day of our life together. And there was certainly no reason for David to spend a decade of our marriage quietly, patiently erasing every trace of her presence from our photographic history. Something more had happened. I just didn't know what yet that I remembered, with a specific, useful clarity, that our wedding planner, a meticulous woman named Denise, no relation to any attorney in this story, just a coincidence of names I've since found slightly funny given everything else that's happened in my life, had kept extremely thorough digital records of our entire planning process, including guest list changes, seating adjustments, and vendor communications, all stored in a shared planning document we'd used. Throughout the engagement that I still had access to that document. I hadn't opened it in nearly a decade. Scrolling back through the full revision history, a feature I didn't even know the document had until I started deliberately looking for it, I found something that reframed everything. 3 weeks before our wedding, there was a flurry of edits to the guest list and seating chart, all made from David's account, adding a single name to his side of the family section, Claire's. The notation beside her name, in the planner's own shorthand, read simply, "Confirmed attending, D's request, please seat W/immediate family, not assigned table." Not assigned table. A guest with no formal seat, added at the last minute, 3 weeks before the wedding, specifically by David's request, placed among immediate family rather than in the general guest section where an ordinary +1 or distant acquaintance would have gone. I messaged Denise directly, unsure if she'd even remember a wedding from 10 years ago among the hundreds she's coordinated since. She responded within a day, and what she told me, carefully, clearly uncomfortable even a decade later, filled in the final piece I needed before I was ready to actually confront David. She remembered Claire specifically, she said, because of how unusual the request had been. David had called her directly, not through me, which was itself outside their normal process, and asked, somewhat urgently, to add a last-minute guest to the family section, explaining only that it was important, and that he'd explain later, which Denise said he never actually did. She remembered Claire arriving alone, staying only through the ceremony and the early part of the reception, and leaving before the dancing began, without saying goodbye to anyone Denise had observed. She remembered, too, a brief, tense conversation she'd witnessed between David and Claire near the coat check, one she hadn't thought much of at the time beyond registering it as slightly odd, the kind of thing you notice and then forget within a wedding full of hundreds of small, forgettable interactions. I asked Denise if she remembered anything else. She paused before answering, then told me something that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was investigating. She said she remembered, specifically, because it had struck her as unusual professional etiquette to note, that Claire had appeared to be visibly, noticeably pregnant. I confronted David 3 days later, once I'd had time to actually sit with what I now understood, or thought I understood, and decide how I wanted to approach a conversation I knew was going to fundamentally alter our marriage regardless of how it went. I laid it all out on our kitchen table, the paired image files from the archive_restore folder, the old social media photo of their engagement, the screenshot of the wedding planning documents revision history, and Denise's account of a pregnant woman arriving specifically at David's request 3 weeks before our wedding and leaving abruptly before the reception truly began. David didn't try to explain away the lighting artifacts this time. He sat there for a long moment, and then he told me the truth, in pieces, the way people tell the truth when they've spent a decade rehearsing exactly how much of it they were willing to eventually share, and clearly hadn't finished deciding even in that moment. He and Claire had been engaged, as I'd found, roughly 2 years before he and I met. The engagement had ended, he said, mutually, over disagreements about where their lives were headed, and he genuinely believed, at the time we met and fell in love, that it was a closed chapter with no remaining consequences. Then, he said, about a month before our wedding, Claire had reached out, unexpectedly, to tell him she was pregnant, and that the child was his, conceived during a brief period of contact between them roughly 9 months earlier, contact he admitted, quietly, that he had never disclosed to me, framing it at the time, even to himself, as an insignificant, one-time lapse he'd told himself didn't need to become a conversation. He said he panicked. He said he didn't know how to process what she'd told him with our wedding 3 weeks away, didn't know how to tell me, genuinely believed, in the specific, catastrophic logic of that moment, that if he could simply see her one more time, in person, understand the full situation, he could figure out the right way to handle it before our wedding rather than after. He invited her to the wedding itself, he said, in a decision he now recognizes as one of the least rational choices of his entire life, because some part of him believed that if she saw the wedding happen, saw the finality of it, it would somehow force a resolution to a problem he had no idea how to actually resolve. I asked him the question that mattered most. I asked if there was a child. There was. A daughter, now 9 years old, whom David had been quietly, financially supporting for her entire life, through a private arrangement with Claire that had never once, in nearly a decade, been disclosed to me in any form. Once the larger truth was out, the smaller mystery, the photographs, finally made a horrible kind of sense. David told me that in the immediate aftermath of our wedding, still not knowing how or whether he would ever tell me the full truth, he'd asked our wedding photographer, a friend of his from college, to remove Claire from a handful of the most prominent formal photographs, framing it to the photographer as an awkward situation involving an uninvited ex he didn't want documented in our official wedding album. The photographer, David said, had done a rough job at the time, using basic photo editing tools available a decade ago, good enough to fool a casual glance but not good enough, apparently, to fool a decade of unconscious memory. As AI image editing tools became dramatically more sophisticated and accessible over the following years, David told me he'd gone back, repeatedly, quietly, to those same photographs, refining the erasure each time newer, more convincing technology became available to him, worried that as our daughter grew older, as photo albums got shown at family gatherings, as the internet's own tools for detecting and analyzing images got more sophisticated in the opposite direction, the crude, decade-old edits might eventually be noticed, and the question of who that woman was, and why she'd been removed, would eventually have to be answered. He told me he'd convinced himself, over 10 years, that continuing to refine the erasure was somehow protecting our family rather than continuing to actively deceive it, that as long as the photographic record stayed clean, the actual, harder conversation could stay indefinitely postponed. I asked him, directly, whether he'd ever planned to tell me the truth if I hadn't found that folder myself. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said he honestly didn't know, and that the not knowing was something he'd been avoiding looking at directly for almost as long as he'd been avoiding telling me. There was a specific quality to how he said it, not defensive, not performing remorse for my benefit, just quietly, exhaustedly honest in a way that felt, in that moment, more damning than any excuse he could have offered instead. I asked him what he'd imagined would happen if I never found the folder at all, whether he'd pictured us growing old together with this secret simply staying buried forever, or whether some part of him had always known, on some level, that a decade of maintenance was ultimately unsustainable, that the truth was always going to surface eventually in one form or another. He said he'd thought about that question more times than he could count over the years, late at night, unable to sleep, and had never once arrived at an answer that didn't make him feel like a coward either way. Telling me meant admitting a decade of active deception, and not telling me meant continuing to actively deceive me, and somewhere in the space between those two unbearable options, he said, he'd simply kept choosing, over and over, to do neither, to just keep maintaining the photographs instead, as though managing the evidence were somehow a substitute for managing the actual truth underneath it. I asked him one more question that night, one I hadn't fully planned to ask but that came out anyway, sitting there at our kitchen table surrounded by printed evidence of a decade I thought I understood. I asked him if he loved me, genuinely. During all those years he was also quietly protecting the secret. He said yes, without hesitation, and I believed him, which was, in its own strange way, one of the more disorienting parts of the entire evening, understanding that a person can genuinely love you, wholly and consistently, while also, simultaneously, sustaining an active deception large enough to require a decade of technological upkeep. Those two things existing at once in the same person, in the same marriage, is something I'm still working through, and I don't think I've fully arrived at peace with it even now. I want to be honest about how that answer landed. It was, in some ways, harder to hear than the original secret itself. A person can understand panic. A person can, with effort, understand one catastrophic decision made 3 weeks before a wedding, made by someone genuinely unequipped in that moment to handle an impossible situation well. What's much harder to sit with is the understanding that the concealment wasn't a single decision at all. It was a decade of small, ongoing, deliberate choices, each one a fresh opportunity to tell the truth that got quietly declined in favor of one more round of digital retouching. There was one more conversation I felt I needed to have before I could really consider this fully investigated, and that was with Tom, David's college friend who'd shot our wedding and, I now knew, had done the first, crude round of editing all those years ago. Tom and David had drifted apart somewhat over the years, the way college friendships sometimes do, so reaching out to him felt strange, almost formal, after nearly a decade of only occasional contact at holiday parties. I asked him directly, over the phone, whether he remembered editing Claire out of our wedding photos. There was a long pause before he answered, long enough that I understood the answer before he actually said anything. He told me David had come to him about 10 days after the wedding, visibly distressed, and asked for what he'd framed as a small, understandable favor, removing a handful of photos of an uninvited ex from the official album, explaining just enough of the situation, the unexpected pregnancy, the panic, to make the request feel less like deception and more like damage control. Tom said he'd hesitated, uncomfortable even then with what he was being asked to do, but ultimately agreed, telling himself it was a small, harmless edit, a favor between friends, nothing that would ever really matter beyond a handful of formal photographs. He said he had no idea David had continued the editing on his own, years after Tom's own involvement had ended, using tools that didn't even exist yet when he'd done his original, rougher edits. He sounded genuinely unsettled learning that what he'd assumed was a single, contained favor a decade ago had apparently become an ongoing, secret project that continued for years after he'd handed David the finished files and considered his part in it finished. I don't think Tom bears meaningful responsibility for what came after his involvement ended, and I told him as much. But that conversation added one more piece to a picture that kept getting larger the more I looked at it, a picture of how many small, seemingly contained decisions it actually takes to sustain a secret of this size over 10 years, and how many people, even peripherally, end up quietly complicit in maintaining it without ever fully understanding the scope of what they were actually helping to hide. That I made the decision, about 6 weeks after the confrontation, to reach out to Claire directly, a choice David was hesitant about but ultimately didn't try to stop, and one I don't regret, even though it was one of the more surreal conversations of my life. Claire was, in almost every way, not what I'd built her into during the weeks of investigation that preceded actually speaking with her. She wasn't a villain in this story, and she made that clear immediately, with a kind of weary, practiced patience that told me she'd clearly anticipated this conversation might happen someday, even if she hadn't known when. She told me her own version of events, which aligned almost entirely with what David had told me, with one addition that reframed things further. She said she'd never asked David to marry her, never asked him to leave me, never wanted anything from him beyond acknowledgement and support for their daughter, and that showing up at the wedding itself had been David's idea, not hers, a decision she'd gone along with at the time out of her own confusion and grief, and one she said she'd regretted for years afterward. She told me their daughter's name was Nora, and that Nora knew, in an age-appropriate way, that her biological father was someone who supported her but wasn't present in her daily life the way a typical father would be, a framing Claire said she'd built carefully over the years to protect Nora from a more complicated truth she wasn't sure Nora was ready to fully understand yet. I asked Claire, near the end of our conversation, whether she resented me, whether a part of her had spent the last decade watching David's life with someone else with any bitterness. She said something that has genuinely stayed with me since. She said her anger, if she'd ever really had it, had never been at me. I hadn't known any of this was happening, hadn't made any of the choices that shaped it, and that whatever anger existed had always correctly belonged with David, for the specific choice to invite her to a wedding he was making to someone else, and for the decade of silence that followed. I asked her, too, about that day itself, why she'd agreed to come, knowing what it would mean to stand in a church watching the man who'd gotten her pregnant marry someone else. She was quiet for a while before answering, and when she did, her voice had a different quality to it, something rawer than the careful, practiced tone she'd used through most of our conversation. She said she genuinely hadn't known what she wanted, walking into that day. Some part of her, she admitted, had hoped that seeing her, confronting the reality of what was happening in person, might change something, not necessarily stop the wedding, she said, but at least force an honest conversation before it happened rather than after. She said watching the ceremony instead, watching David make vows to someone else while she sat in a pew carrying his child, was one of the worst experiences of her life, and that leaving before the reception properly began wasn't planned dramatics. She simply couldn't stay in that room a moment longer than she had to. She told me that in the years since, she'd made a conscious decision to build a life for Nora that didn't revolve around waiting for David to eventually do the right thing, and that the financial support he'd provided, while genuinely useful, had never been a substitute for the more difficult things: presence, honesty, a real relationship, that she'd stopped expecting from him somewhere around Nora's 3rd birthday. Hearing that specific detail, a 3-year-old's birthday used as an internal marker for when hope had finally, quietly given out, is something I don't think I'll ever fully stop thinking about. The hardest part of everything that followed wasn't the conversation with Claire. It was the slow, careful process of figuring out what our family's relationship to Nora would look like. Going forward, a 9-year-old girl who existed, entirely through no fault or choice of her own, at the center of a secret that had shaped a decade of my marriage without my knowledge. David and I spent months in counseling working through what honesty, going forward, would actually mean, not just between the two of us, but for our own 2 children, who are old enough now to eventually notice, the way I once noticed, a face missing from a photograph, or ask a question about a half-sister they'd have every right to eventually know about. We made the decision, together, carefully, to begin building a real, if slow, relationship with Nora, not to erase the complicated circumstances of how she came to exist in our family story, but to stop the specific pattern of erasure that had defined the last decade. It felt, in a strange, almost symbolic way, like the opposite of what David had spent 10 years doing to those photographs. Instead of removing someone from the record, we were choosing, deliberately, to add her back in. I won't pretend that process has been simple, or that it's finished. My own children are still working through a version of this news that's age-appropriate but still genuinely difficult, the discovery that their family history is more complicated than the version they'd always understood. But I've watched, over the past several months, something slowly begin to heal that I genuinely wasn't sure could heal at all when I first opened that folder on our family computer 8 months ago. Telling our own 2 children was, in some ways, harder than any other conversation in this entire process, harder even than confronting David himself. Our oldest, who is 11, asked a question that neither David nor I were fully prepared for, even after weeks of rehearsing how we might handle this conversation with a child psychologist's guidance. She asked whether that meant David had lied to me, specifically, using that word, lied, with the blunt clarity children sometimes have that adults spend years learning to soften. We didn't try to talk her out of that word. We told her the truth, that yes, he had, for a very long time, and that we were working, together, as a family, to make sure that kind of secret-keeping never happened again, in either direction. Our younger child, only 7, understood far less of the specifics and mostly needed reassurance that nothing about our immediate family, our house, our routines, the 4 of us, was actually changing. In some ways I found that simpler question easier to answer honestly, because it was true. Nora's presence in our extended family story was expanding, not replacing anything that already existed. We've since had 2 in-person visits with Nora, carefully arranged, slow, deliberately unpressured on all sides. She is, by every account I've been able to gather from spending time with her directly, a thoughtful, curious 9-year-old who has clearly been raised by a mother who prioritized her stability above almost everything else, including, I now understand, above her own right to a fuller, more public acknowledgement of who Nora's father actually was for most of Nora's life. I think about that imbalance often, how much of the burden of managing this secret fell to Claire alone, for years, while David quietly maintained a separate, false version of events in a set of photographs 40 minutes away. That I've thought a lot, in the months since, about why the photograph specifically became the thing that undid a decade of careful concealment, when so many other, more direct pieces of evidence might have surfaced first and didn't. I think it's because photographs occupy a specific, protected place in how families understand their own history. We don't just look at wedding photos. We build our memory of an event partly out of the photographs themselves, especially as the actual, lived memory fades with time. David understood that, I think, on some instinctive level, even if he never articulated it to himself so directly, that if he could control the photographic record, he could control, to some meaningful degree, the story our family would eventually tell itself about how it began. What he didn't account for was memory's own stubborn persistence, the fact that I remembered 7 people in that group photo even after a decade, even after the professional, formally posed version had quietly become 6. Memory, it turns out, is a far more reliable archive than we tend to give it credit for, and far harder to fully overwrite than any photograph, no matter how sophisticated the tools used to alter it become. I've also thought a great deal about what this specific kind of deception says about how technology has quietly changed what long-term secrecy is even possible now. A decade ago, David's college friend did a rough, amateur job hiding Claire in a handful of photos, using tools that would have eventually, inevitably, been noticeable to anyone looking closely. Today, the same erasure can be executed cleanly enough that an ordinary person, looking at an ordinary photograph, would have no reason whatsoever to suspect anything had ever been altered at all. That capability existing in the hands of anyone with an internet connection and a reason to use it is something I think about now in a way I never had reason to before any of this happened. The forensics consultant I spoke with explained something to me during our follow-up conversation that I think is worth sharing more broadly, since I know I'm not the only person who's going to hear this story and go looking, nervously, through their own family photographs afterward. She said the specific tell in most amateur AI edits, the kind a person without professional training might actually be able to catch on their own, tends to show up in 3 places, repeating or subtly warped patterns in backgrounds where the software has had to invent texture rather than copy it, fabric, foliage, brickwork. Shadows that don't consistently point toward the same light source as everything else in the frame, and reflective surfaces, mirrors, glasses, polished floors, where an edited-out figure sometimes leaves a faint, inconsistent ghost of themselves behind, because the AI tool corrected the primary image but never accounted for what should have appeared in the reflection. That last detail, she told me, is the one editors miss most often, even skilled ones, because it requires thinking about a photograph in a way most people simply never have reason to. I don't share that to turn anyone into an amateur forensic investigator of their own family history. I share it because I think there's something valuable in understanding, even at a basic level, how the tools that make this kind of quiet, sustained deception possible actually function, not out of suspicion, but out of the same instinct that made me sit on my hallway floor for an hour, staring at a group of 6 people my memory insisted had always been 7. That I don't tell this story to make anyone permanently suspicious of every photograph they've ever been shown, or to suggest that most marriages are built on some version of this level of concealment. Most aren't. What happened in mine was the result of one specific, catastrophic decision made under panic 3 weeks before a wedding, followed by a decade of choices that kept compounding rather than correcting themselves. If there's something I'd genuinely ask you to take from this, it's not paranoia about photographs specifically. It's a broader awareness that secrets, especially the kind maintained through active, ongoing effort rather than simple omission, tend to require more and more energy to sustain over time, not less, and that energy, that maintenance, usually leaves some kind of trace, even when the technology involved is sophisticated enough that the trace itself is nearly invisible. I found mine in a shadow that looked slightly too smooth, in a group of 6 people where my memory insisted there had always been 7. I also want to say something about David directly, because I think it would be dishonest to end this story painting him as a simple villain, when the truth is considerably more complicated than that. He made one catastrophic decision under panic, followed by 10 years of smaller, quieter decisions that each felt, to him in the moment, more manageable than finally telling the truth. I don't think that makes what he did acceptable. I do think understanding the specific mechanism, panic, followed by the slow, compounding momentum of an unaddressed secret, matters more than simply labeling him a villain and moving on, because I think that mechanism is far more common, and far more human, than most of us are comfortable admitting. David and I are still married. I want to be honest that this isn't a story with a simple, tidy resolution. It's a story about a marriage that's had to fundamentally rebuild its foundation around a truth it should have been built on from the beginning, and that rebuilding is still ongoing, some days easier than others. What I can tell you is that our photographs, going forward, are staying exactly as they are. No more editing. No more quiet maintenance of a version of our history that was never true to begin with. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that something you trusted completely, a memory, a photograph, a version of your own history, turned out to have been quietly rewritten without your knowledge, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned since, every day.